This is an unrehearsed program. The views expressed are those of the guests and not necessarily those of the producer. Today's topic:
our worst predictions from last year in Passion for Truth award-winning program.
Welcome to another edition of Passion for Truth. Many predictions of 2014 did not come true. Things got scary across the globe when Russia annexed Crimea, when the Islamic State turned out to be a vicious enemy, when the euro economy stagnated, and when Ebola terrorized many countries, including the US, and many more events scared the American public. Did the predictions of worst-case scenario come out to be true? Let's ask our panelists next. Dr. Gregory Stanton, President, Genocide Watch, professor at the George Mason University. Dr. Stanton was formerly affiliated with the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. Dr. Dennis Warner, formerly from Pax Christi, the International Catholic Peace Movement, as the Senior Technical Advisor to the Catholic Relief Services. Dr. Warner has visited more than 50 countries on a variety of international and governmental issues. George Nestuchek from Nestuchek and Associates, as a former staff director at the U.S. House of Representatives. Mr. Nestuchek maintains a comprehensive knowledge of third world countries, especially of Ukraine and Russia. And Reagan George, management consultant specializing in strategic planning and project management. He is a member of the Northern Virginia Tea Party. Welcome you all. Starting with you, Greg. When the American economy shrank by more than 2% in the first quarter of 2014, it prompted a lot of concerns that American economy was going into recession. But both gross domestic product and employment accelerated for the rest of 2014. Was that improved economy a surprise for many people?
It may have been for many people. It wasn't a surprise for me because I knew that President Obama was surrounded by economic advisors who actually finally learned that John Maynard Keynes was right about how to avoid recessions. In other words, that you keep the interest rates low and you keep the public expenditures high, you don't worry about the deficit, and in fact, it worked. And that is why we've now got more than 2 million jobs that have been created in 2014.
Was the best year, Dennis, was it the best year of job creation since the 1990s?
Perhaps in numbers it was, but looking at what were those 2 million jobs, many of them were in the low-paying service sector, flipping hamburgers for minimum wage. The middle-class jobs that paid in the $30,000 to $50,000 to $60,000 a year area, many of those jobs were lost and unfortunately have been lost forever. So while we have increased our jobs and decrease the unemployment, the quality of these jobs is not as it was before.
It wasn't a whole lot better economic prosperity end of 2014 as the forecasters have stated?
Well, I think I look at it as kind of a relative situation. Compared to previous years, we're better off. Compared to where we should be, we're not so well off. We've got far fewer people working as a percentage of the working population now than we did 10, 15 years ago. So we are worse off in that respect. And the quality of the jobs, as Dennis just pointed out, is not there. It's not something you can build a future economy on. It's, it sustains itself right now, but there's not room for growth in there. We've really suppressed a lot of the potential that we have through our taxation policies and disincentivized all the creativity that we need to create the high-tech jobs and the future economy. So we're looking better than we did at the beginning of the year, and we're looking certainly a lot better than the rest of the world, absolutely.
Yes.
But on a relative basis only.
George makes a good point that we are looking good that compared to the rest of the global economy, which was shaky compared to the one in the U.S. Do you buy into that premise, Reagan?
I didn't understand the question.
That compared to the rest of the world, the global our economy in U.S. was much better in 2014.
May have been a lot better than the rest of the world. I don't trust the numbers. I've seen Bureau of Labor Statistics and all change numbers all over the place. We've had huge numbers of people that have just quit looking for jobs. A lot of the jobs that were full-time have now become part-time thanks to Obamacare. The EPA is just clobbering small businesses with regulation after regulation after regulation. So is it better today than 2009, 2010? Yeah, probably, but probably in spite of Obama, not because of him.
The quality of the jobs was not so great.
The quality of the jobs, I think, has decreased, and they moved from being full-time 40 hours to 30 hours to get under the Obamacare limits.
Let's move to Ebola. Greg, people had predicted that the epidemic would spread into Nigeria and other countries, and many senators kept saying that the disease was far more contagious than the Obama administration had stated. Do you think those scary talks turned out to be groundless eventually?
Well, they weren't groundless because, in fact, Ebola is incredibly infectious. But what was underestimated was the skill that really scientific containment of this epidemic could achieve. And in fact, in Nigeria, it did achieve. And in some other countries, Mali, for example, and in a number of other West African countries, they managed to basically contain it. They also have pretty much contained it in the rest of the world. So I think the truth is we are now seeing a victory of science over one of mankind's worst enemies, which is epidemic disease.
But do you still see merit in those predictions that we had? I mean, there were only a handful of cases in U.S.
Well, that's the predictions, which were very dire, were basically predictions of the worst case scenarios. And I'm glad they made those predictions because they were really right to make those predictions. So when Senator Rand Paul, for instance, was warning, look, we got something here that's as bad as AIDS, it was good that he made that statement because it really is as bad as AIDS.
But there was a much higher survival rate in U.S. compared to Ebola victims in Africa.
That's correct. And it's partly because of our amazingly better healthcare system in this country.
How did Dennis Way fail to predict that the disease was more amenable to treatment? I mean, why were we so darn scared? The number of new cases in Liberia had declined, but we kept saying, there is no treatment for this disease.
Well, I think there's an optimistic overreaction to the slowdown in the number of cases that is occurring right now. We have not conquered the disease, and we have not stopped the disease. The disease is still spreading. There's more than 20,000 people that have been infected, more than 8,000 have died. It's a 40% death rate, and that's only because infected people who will die shortly haven't been recorded yet. But the disease is extremely infectious, and if you listen to the director of the CDC, Tom Friedman, and others who are close to the problem, they say optimism is taking over now, and people are forgetting that this is a highly infectious disease that still needs a lot of attention. Unfortunately, we tend to have a limited attention span in this country. It's sort of the news cycle. As it goes off the news and we think the problem is over, it's not. The reason that the disease has been treated and cured in some cases is because we've learned how to deal with it better. Ebola was only discovered about 40 years ago in Central Africa, and when it was discovered, it was in remote villages where the people, for the most part, had died by the time the researchers got there. So there was no backlog of experience in how to treat it. Now we have better treatment methods. We have some new vaccines in development, and there's issues of transferring the blood from people who have survived with antibodies into patients who are now suffering from the disease. So we have a lot of new ideas on how to do it, but it takes some time to do that, and there was no backlog of experience to tell the health community how to treat the disease when it first burst out less than a year ago.
What's your take, George?
Well, Dennis raises some very, very good points. I think that the degree of infectiousness of the disease is indicated by the fact that the cases we had here in the United States were healthcare workers that had been exposed even though they were all covered in protective garb. So that tells you how deadly the disease, how infectious it truly is. The fact that we were able to treat these patients is we had access to the technology today and a growing experience base. And with our healthcare technology, we were able to save these patients, but for one who came in too late. But I think the progress that's been made, and it hasn't been stopped in Africa, the progress that has been made in containment is because those countries are far more radical in their approach in containment. They don't mind violating individual citizens' rights to keep a village isolated from the rest of the country. We don't practice that here. But it took drastic action of that sort over there to get it under some degree of control in West Africa.
When do you come on, Regan?
My daughter is a registered nurse down in Virginia Beach, and I talked to her about this, and every hospital now has a protocol just in case somebody walks into their emergency room and actually has the disease. They have screening methods, etc. So I'm a little bit biased. I don't believe in importing the disease. The way that they were able to get the doctors and nurses that were infected in, I thought was very good as far as the approach that they took. But I'm still in favor of quarantining people before they come to America.
George, were we prepared for the prospect of Russia grabbing Crimea and a war in eastern Ukraine?
No, absolutely not prepared. We weren't even prepared in the response after it happens.
Did we do a poor job at forcing things that flared up suddenly?
Well, I don't know that the U.S. had a job to do here at all. I was much more concerned about the response once Russia took those measures. We certainly shouldn't have been surprised based on their past record, most recently in Georgia in 2008, when there was no retribution for that. It was just a question of time when Russia was going to violate some other neighbor's border.
You know, the interesting thing to me about this, and George and I have worked on Ukrainian independence for, 30 years now, together. One of the things we realized is that the Soviet Union's Achilles heel was nationalism. That is, that many parts of the Soviet Union consisted of nations. I mean, like Ukraine, for instance, and Kazakhstan, and a whole lot of other nations. And so if you could convince people that, in fact, they had the option of becoming independent as nations, the Soviet Union would fall apart. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Well, what's very ironic about the attack on Crimea and on eastern Ukraine now by Russia is Putin has taken notes on what was used to tear apart the Soviet Union. And he said, okay, if nationalism will work, to tear apart the Soviet Union, nationalism can also be appealed to bring Crimea, which is, very heavily Russian-speaking, and also eastern Ukraine, which is also Russian-speaking, back into Russia. That was his basic logic. Now, I happen to know that he wasn't altogether right about that, because a lot of our strongest allies in the independence movement were Eastern Ukrainian miners. They may speak Russian, but boy, they wanted independence. So I'm not sure how this is going to eventually, play out and what their final result will be. But I do know that the sanctions that we have, levied on Russian leaders have had the intended effect of really saying to Mr. Putin, look, you can't just get away with this.
Dennis, when Russia annexed Crimea, the world leaders and news commentators were worried that Putin would grab Kazakhstan and the Baltics. What happened to the territorial expansion? Nothing happened.
Well, I think he would have considered moving further on this plan, except international events changed. We have the great production of oil in the last 2 years, and you can call it an oil glut if you're from an oil-producing country. And this, since petroleum was the major foreign currency earner for Russia, the price of oil dropping by 50% in the matter of just 6 months has greatly affected his ability to do things. That has caused problems with the banks. The banks are failing, and public opinion is turning sour. Now the danger is that he may say that things are getting so bad that some military adventures are necessary to bring the nationalist fervor together and strengthen his control. And I think that is probably an issue that worries the State Department now.
Is that a worry, legitimate worry, considering?
I'm not sure it's a legitimate worry. His problems right now, in addition to a collapsing economy, are the body bags that are coming back out of Ukraine into Russia. During the Afghan incursion back in 78, 79, one of the reasons they pulled out was there was an uproar in the Soviet Union with all the soldiers, all the deaths coming back. No one really wanted to pursue it. They didn't think Afghanistan was worth it. So the political leadership pulled out of there. They suffered a tremendous loss in the process, and that's what's facing Putin right now. There were committees of mothers of soldiers that were very active in the 70s in the Soviet Union. The mothers of soldiers are very active today, and they're having a hard time communicating because of the controls on the internet and social media in Russia. But we are seeing the postings, we are seeing data coming out where mothers are talking about local bases, how many soldiers are, and these are young men. They were conscripted. They didn't volunteer for service in Ukraine. So losing young men who had no taste for war, no desire for war, is becoming a much more of an internal problem for Putin. That, coupled with economic crash, has slowed him down. They're already backing off on some of the hostile talk towards Ukraine. So 2015, 2016 should see significant changes there. But as far as military adventurism in Kazakhstan or the Baltic states, that's definitely on hold at this point. But they do have an agenda of politically undermining their neighbors. They've been doing that for 20 years. They do that in Kazakhstan. They're very active in the Baltic states, which is why the Balts are so hyper about Russian activities on their border. And of course, Hungary, the right-wing parties in Hungary are getting funding from Russia. The Czech Republic, similarly, Bulgaria, Romania. The Russians are very active all over Eastern Europe.
So, Regan, did we predict that Russia's oil-based economy will implode, or its currency might collapse?
We predicted that, and I'd like to see us be sure to wean Europe off of Russian oil, or at least give them options so that they can wean themselves off Russian oil if they need to. The other thing that troubled me about all this was when they shot down the Malaysian airliner, there was no response from the world about that. I would have at least canceled some flights from Russia on their airline. I think that would have hurt them quite a bit. And we did nothing except argue about who's going to get the bodies.
Do you think the biggest threat, Greg, from Russia will come from its weakness, not its strength?
That is a really interesting question. I think perhaps from its weakness.